Nintendo Switch 2 editions are a key plank of Nintendo's strategy at present, and so in this video I wanted to break down exactly how these titles are being used, what the patterns and strategies appear to be, and what might follow in the rest of the Switch 2 generation. Firstly, I still suspect a significant number of first-party Switch 1 games will get some kind of Switch 2 upgrade, whether it's the kind of graphical uplift seen in Super Mario Odyssey and Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, or a full-on expansion, such as we've seen with Kirby and the Forgotten Land. In terms of specific Nintendo Switch 2 edition titles, though, we have a few examples. Firstly, there's The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Now, these were actually the only first-party Zelda offerings during 2025, although of course Koei Tecmo's Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment was published by Nintendo outside Japan and clearly features Nintendo IP. While there was no significant upgrade beyond graphics to the games themselves, the addition of the Zelda Notes functionality is interesting as a way to further integrate their expansion pass players into Nintendo's smartphone ecosystem, allowing them ever more precise data from their legions of smartphone users. Super Mario Party Jamboree and Kirby and the Forgotten Land actually had Plus games added on, but the pricing structure of the Nintendo Switch 2 editions seems to me to put kind of a ceiling on the scope that these could offer, with most Nintendo Switch games going for $60 and the ceiling for Nintendo Switch 2 at $80, since I doubt they will want any game to top Mario Kart World in the medium term at least, unless as with Ring Fit Adventure it has some kind of hardware pack-in. Now, for all these reasons, I wouldn't expect Nintendo Switch 2 editions to be particularly significant in terms of the expansion they offer most of the time. Nothing certainly like Super Smash Bros., although there may be some flexibility for something bigger for some specific games. For example, Clubhouse Games has obviously been pretty successful, and they did a Nintendo Switch 2 upgrade patch right out of the gate. Because it wasn't full price, adding a massive upgrade and releasing a new edition that takes it from 51 to, say, 101 worldwide classics seems like a decent way to approach a sequel to the previous game rather than just doing a version of the same game that either repeats old modes or misses out some of the most iconic classic titles of all. In recent times, we've also had the announcement of Animal Crossing New Horizons' far more restrained Nintendo Switch 2 edition upgrade, although it was launched alongside a more substantial base game update as well. It almost feels like Nintendo is experimenting with various different formats, and it's very clear that each of these titles is being assessed individually. We should also recognise that the titles they've brought over are mostly, to start with, their most popular Switch titles, which aren't imminently receiving direct sequels. So Mario Kart 8 Deluxe has Mario Kart World following it and so hasn't had an upgrade, and the Super Mario games seem well positioned for a second-year sequel, as has been the precedent in a few recent consoles, and so we've seen upgrades but not full Nintendo Switch 2 editions for example, Super Mario Odyssey. However, titles like ARMS, Kirby, and others may look a while longer for something totally new, and so having a smaller scale upgrade at this point makes sense. In the case of Super Mario Party, Nintendo Cube has had a pretty fixed 3-yearly schedule, which would put the next title in 2027, so the Jamboree TV DLC made sense as an option here. Also, because Sakurai has been so focused on Kirby Air Riders, I think the question of what will happen with Super Smash Bros. Ultimate can't really be deduced from whether or not they've yet to launch a Nintendo Switch 2 edition or upgrade for the original Smash Ultimate, although I have talked about this in a separate video and so won't go into it anymore at this point. Now, early in the Switch 2's life, when the installed base is still relatively small, focusing on the biggest Switch titles to bring over makes a lot of sense. If you're charging a premium price for upgrades, you want a lot of those people as a base so that you're going to get a lot of take-up early on, and it's also logical to put the most popular Switch games on the shelves for Switch 2, as some purchasers of the new console wouldn't have been around for the predecessor or might have missed some specific games. Channel regular Ollie has also pointed out that they may be using these titles as warm-up marketing for future releases, something we did see with Forgotten Lands extra mode coming right before Air Riders. This is definitely something Nintendo do, and although I'm unsure we've seen too much of this just yet, as we get into the deeper cut titles, it feels like a strategy we could expect to see more and more. For example, if and when they announce a new game or even films for big titles like Luigi's Mansion, Xenoblade and Metroid, dropping upgrades of the prior titles seems like a way to do what they did with Pikmin 1 plus 2 releasing alongside Pikmin 4 in terms of creating a slight moment around franchises that would maximize their profitability. Some of the big games remain notable by their absence, though. I've mentioned in a separate video that the absence of Luigi's Mansion 3 may well mean that a Luigi's Mansion 3 Plus Nintendo Switch 2 edition is indeed on the cards. I suspect if they had a new title coming out too imminently, they might have been keener to rush out an upgrade to the past game, much like they did with Super Mario Odyssey, and while it's completely possible that Luigi's Mansion 4 is indeed this year, a Luigi's Mansion 3 Plus game to hold the haunted fort for a couple of years also feels logical to me. Absent Plus games so far include entries in slightly smaller franchises like Pikmin 4, Metroid Dread, and Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze, but these feel like far better shouts as the install base of the Switch 2 grows. Pikmin 4 has received some upgrades recently, so perhaps nothing is too imminent, and while Metroid Dread would look amazing with graphical enhancements, I'm not sure they see too much benefit in further Nintendo Switch 2 Plus games for Metroid as opposed to something new, although I do think Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is a title that I think has huge potential, and it really depends here on whether Retro is likely to return to Donkey Kong Country at all. Even if they don't, there is a residual team there who worked on the past titles, and so a smaller scale expansion does feel like a plausible way to follow up the big start that Donkey Kong Bonanza had in 2025, bringing the Donkey Kong franchise back into the spotlight. The obvious titles in the camp of niche but graphically awesome titles that would look amazing with a patch would probably be the Xenoblade Chronicles series. My guess is that a lot will rest on what they want to do with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is the most successful game in terms of sales as far as we know, but also it's the game where the ambition and the graphical reality are most often at odds. Having done a full definitive edition of Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles X, the next logical step in this progression would be Xenoblade Chronicles 2. And while it would seem odd with Xenoblade Chronicles 2 already available on the same machine, it would obviously be a huge step forward in terms of the look of Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and this is something that Nintendo has done before. For example, they put Twilight Princess HD out on the Wii U, even though the base game was still available on the Wii, which was compatible with the Wii U. Now, these games have added complexities in terms of upgrades because there's also the DLC to upgrade in some cases, and this might be another reason why they haven't been released so far, especially if they were planning to coordinate the upgrades for multiple games, which might explain why X didn't receive a day one upgrade, even though it had only just released when the Switch 2 launched. My guess is that they will want to give the Xenoblade games their own moment for an upgrade, and that 3, Definitive Edition, and X are all likely to get the nod, but probably not Xenoblade Chronicles 2. A less hype game, but one I think could see an expansion the next year or so, is Brain Training, whose first game was already called Nintendo Switch Edition, and so a Nintendo Switch 2 edition on the shelves and offered as an expansion for existing players. Feels like it makes sense to keep it alive as a casual audience perennial. Notably, while Big Brain Academy Brain vs. Brain received an early Nintendo Switch 2 patch, Brain Training doesn't appear to have received the same treatment. Another pair of titles that are often left out of upgrade discussions but seem very likely to me are the Mario plus Rabbids titles. The fate of new entries in this series is remaining in question, with Davide Soliani having said arrivederci to Ubisoft, and with the company reportedly being a bit disappointed in 2022's Sparks of Hope, a title Nintendo themselves suggested could wait for new hardware. It's plausible that Ubisoft could still commission a game, but some kind of new stock-keeping unit, a complete edition, or even, given how lower priced the prior games now sell for, a double pack and complete edition might be a way to raise the title's profiles and prestige a little bit. I wouldn't expect anything new added to it particularly, but I'm sure that there are many people who worked on it that could step up and add something different, and perhaps a late-stage addition to either a Plus game would be a low-cost, low-effort way to get Ubisoft's titles into the frame in the wake of the Mario movie. Either way, I do think this is something that Nintendo and Ubisoft will probably want to collaborate on at some point, mainly because Ubisoft need the money and they have a Mario franchise which is very high profile at the moment, and so they might as well cash in. There may also be titles where upgrades aren't really that cost effective. I love Advance Wars and Famicom Detective Club, but these titles remain fairly niche, and I'm not completely convinced that the costs of creating an upgrade would be worth it for the return they would get. However, in the bigger franchises, even older games may have quite a bit of potential. Most interesting to me is the fate of older games which have more or less faded into obscurity, but especially for the younger facing type of games, could re-emerge as new to players who perhaps weren't even born when the originals came out. Yoshi's Crafted World, Kirby Star Allies, Paper Mario, The Origami King, Pikmin 3 Deluxe, even Luigi's Mansion 2 could all be revived almost as new with a significant Plus game. Waiting 10 years and doing a new version has been a Nintendo strategy for ages, and if these games have a lower or inactive install bases, it might be a cost-effective way to revive them. Ultimately, I don't really expect this to happen very often, but even once in a while would be quite a surprise, and I could see why it might be beneficial to revive an old title if they don't have a new one up their sleeve. One other aspect to consider is that at some point, probably years if not decades into the future, but someday, Nintendo will move past Switch 2, and while Switch 2 compatibility will probably persist, they may wish to cut their losses on having the new machine run Switch 1 games natively, at least outside of a Nintendo Switch Online app. Having Switch 2 versions in this way probably helps to preserve Nintendo's core library that they want to sell, while weeding out those games that they don't view as especially helpful to them in the medium term at least. Where are we then? I think at this point I would make the following estimates. 70% at least 4 new Nintendo Switch 2 versions announced during 2026. 50% at least one Xenoblade Chronicles Nintendo Switch 2 edition or upgrade patch is announced in 2026. 30% some kind of Nintendo Switch 2 upgrade for Mario plus Rabbids games is announced by the end of 2026. 10% a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Yoshi's Crafted World is announced by the end of 2026, and 10% a Nintendo Switch 2 edition of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is announced by the end of 2026. That's it for this video, but thank you as ever for following the channel. Do check out the Patreon for early ad-free and exclusive content, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.